There were rumors that the children of persons who had perished on the scaffold were to be arrested. My brother considered himself as the natural protector not only of me but also of my mother. Despite his youth, he already showed that decision of character and calmness in the face of danger, which he displayed afterwards. "Don't worry," he would say to me. "I'll never abandon you. I won't allow you to be taken away. I'm going to enlist. When I'm a soldier, no one will dare touch my sister or my mother. While I'm off with the army, and until our mother comes back, you can live at La Ferté-Beauharnais." "Go and live all alone without you?" I exclaimed. "I'd never dare do that." "Well, then come along with me. You won't be afraid of the shooting, will you?" "No, I promise you I won't," I answered bravely. Thus, our childish plans, which we considered so easy to carry out, helped reassure us and drove away our fears. But they were unable to dissipate our sorrow for our loss, or our anxiety over our mother's fate. She was to have been executed at the same time as my father. But when she heard her name called, she fell in a swoon, and when she revived, was so weak that it was impossible even to carry her. "We'll take her some other time," declared the men charged with collecting those to be taken to the scaffold. This took place on the 5th Thermidor, July 1794. 4 days later, the fall of Robespierre put an end to the execution and saved our mother. The reign of Robespierre was over, but mother had not yet been released. When we received the visit of the celebrated beauty Madame de Fontenay, who later became Madame Tallien, our visitor petted us and encouraged us with promises that mother would soon be with us again. This indeed happened a few days afterwards. Tallien had been active in bringing about her release, using his influence to the best advantage. When afterwards he asked mother as a favor to receive the woman he had just married and who was attracting a somewhat undesirable amount of attention, could she do otherwise than to comply with his request? General Hoche had been a friend of my father. He had shared his captivity and nearly suffered the same fate, escaping only by a curious accident. In order to increase the number of executions, the authorities were in the habit of implicating a certain number of prisoners in imaginary conspiracies among themselves. Instead of being placed with the other prisoners, Hoche, as a measure of special severity, had been condemned to solitary confinement. Hence, no charge of this sort could be brought against him. It was to this he owed his life. On his release, after the 9th Thermidor, he resumed his rank, sent for Eugène, and took the latter with him when he was appointed commander of the army of the Vendée. Hoche believed that one cannot begin too soon to form a man's character. Although Eugène was only 13 at the time, the general treated him exactly as he would have any other orderly, did not spare him any fatigue, and exposed him to every danger. This was the beginning of my brother's military career. It was at this rough school that he became acquainted with the soldiers' ways and learned how to make himself popular with them. But what the general considered merely part of a useful education filled my mother with alarm. Moreover, Eugène had not completed his regular studies. He was therefore recalled from the army, and he and I were placed at two boarding schools that had just been opened at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The one I entered was presided over by Madame Campan, formerly First Lady-in-Waiting to Marie Antoinette. Ruined by the fall of her royal mistress, without influence or means, but possessing lofty ideals, Madame Campan sought by the use of her superior intelligence and fine mind to earn her livelihood and retain her independence. Such was the woman to whose care I was now confided, and who devoted herself to me with all of a mother's affection and understanding. More anxious to develop our spiritual natures and merely to cultivate such natural accomplishments as we happen to possess, she nevertheless pointed out constantly, by striking examples, the uses we could make of the latter. The misfortunes that befell Marie Antoinette, and to which Madame Campan often referred, made a deep impression on me. I was particularly struck to discover the amount of harm that can be done through malicious gossip, and to note what changes of fortune may befall even persons of the highest rank. The conduct of certain Frenchmen who had sought refuge abroad, and who, while there, were willing to stoop to begging rather than earn a living by honest toil, taught me another lesson. I felt it to be truly independent, one must first acquire those things that ensure this independence. In other words, strength of character and a sound education. I sought earnestly to develop these qualities, although handicapped by too great natural facility of execution, which interfered with serious concentration. But I was the more assiduous in my efforts as my mind was constantly haunted by the thought of my mother's captivity and my father's tragic fate. My imagination was still so dominated by these memories that I constantly felt a menace suspended over me. The thought of being able to overcome it filled me with delight, and I rejoiced in the idea that no matter what fate might have in store for me, I should never stoop or humiliate myself. But the future did not always wear such a gloomy aspect. Adele Agui, niece of Madame Campan, a girl of my own age with a divinely sweet disposition, had become my closest friend, the depositary of my innermost thoughts. To her I described the romance of my life as it was to be in the days to come. I intend to be happy, I used to say, for I shall be ready to meet whatever may befall me. My ambition is to acquire moral courage. Armed with that, one need fear nothing. I want my husband, whoever he may be, to love me. To win his affection, I shall educate myself in such a way that if he proves too worldly, I shall know how to make him more serious-minded. If he is jealous, I shall be ready to sacrifice all social pleasures for his sake. In short, I shall cure him, whatever ailment he may have. We spent the greater part of our recesses in such conversation, and as I grew older, these ideas became more and more firmly fixed in my mind. Although less high-strung than I, my friend had come to share my views. I had preached them with all the further fervor of my convictions, till she had adopted them as her own. It is with pleasure I dwell on these early years, the only happy days I ever had. Never again did I wield as absolute a power as that which my schoolfellows conferred on me. Why did they do so? They could not surmise the rank my family would later occupy. Was it because certain natural gifts attract as much attention at boarding school as they do in society? Was it because I was more advanced than the others in my studies, first in music, in drawing, in dancing, the fastest runner, the best at games, as well as in the classroom? No, I believe I owed my popularity, the sort of suzerainty I possessed, to my constant, all-absorbing desire to be loved, a desire which expressed itself in every one of my actions. I was so afraid of creating jealousy that I sought to conceal anything that made me look superior to the rest. For instance, I had at boarding school a very beautiful lace veil. Not only would I not wear it, but I would not even let my fellow pupils see it for fear it might make them envious. I disliked having the teacher hold me up as a model and was tempted to make a deliberate mistake so that the other girl might not feel humiliated. At any rate, I always found an excuse for her. I was frequently called upon to decide controversies between two of my comrades, and my verdict was received with respect. If a new girl entered the school who was awkward in her behavior and was made fun of by the other pupils, I would take her under my protection, and at once the teasing would stop. Each girl was supposed to take her turn in keeping the classroom neat and tidy. I was anxious to do my share, but whenever my turn came, the other girls struggled to be allowed to do my work for me. It was considered a privilege. This general admiration was very dear to me, but perhaps it caused me to become too accustomed to being sincerely liked and admired. What a disappointment it is when we realize that the people about us are generally hypocrites. This is especially true if your nature is too sensitive not to be hurt by that casual attitude which criticizes without taking the trouble to understand, or that malicious spirit which condemns unjustly. I can declare, however, that the fact of being admittedly a favorite at school aroused in me only an overmastering desire to deserve this popularity. Later, this wish to be liked did me harm. For having acted as I thought for the best, I could not understand why I did not receive the praise I felt was due me. My mother had put us in school, but she could not bear not to see us often, and very frequently we were sent to Paris. During one of these trips, she informed us she was dining with the director, Barras, and that we were to accompany her. "Is it possible, Mother?" I exclaimed impetuously. "You actually associate with such people? Have you not forgotten our family's misfortunes?" "My daughter," she answered with that angelic gentleness which never left her, You must consider the fact that since your father's death, I have been obliged to attempt to save as much of his fortune as possible in order that it should not be lost to you. Should I be ungrateful towards those who have helped and protected me? I recognized that I was wrong. I begged my mother's pardon and went with her to the directory established in the Palace of the Luxembourg. Barras had invited a number of guests, of whom Tallien and his wife were the only ones I knew. At the dinner table, I found myself placed between my mother and a general who, in order to talk to her, kept leaning forward so often and with so much vivacity that he tired me, and I was forced to push back my chair. I thus found myself obliged to examine closely his countenance, which was handsome, very expressive, but remarkably pale. He spoke with great animation and apparently devoted his entire attention to my mother. It was General Bonaparte, and his interest in her was due to an incident which I must relate. Following the riots on the 13th Vendemiaire, October 4th, 1795, a law was passed forbidding any private citizen to have weapons in his house. My brother, unable to bear the thought of surrendering the sword that had belonged to his father, hurried off to see General Bonaparte, who at that time was in command of the troops stationed in Paris. He told the general he would kill himself rather than give up the sword. The general, touched by his emotion, granted his request and at the same time asked the name of his mother, saying he would be glad to meet a woman who could inspire her son with such ideals. Whatever might have been the cause, the general's very evident interest in my mother reminded me that she might someday remarry. This idea was painful to me, as I told my brother with whom I discussed the matter, "She won't love us as much as she does now." When the general called at our house, he felt the coolness of our reception. He did his best to change our attitude, but his method with me did not succeed. He tried to tease me, making fun of women in general, and the more vigorously I defended my sex, the more violently he attacked it. I was about to be confirmed. The general declared I was bigoted. When I answered, "You are confirmed, why shouldn't I be?" he laughed at having roused my temper. I, not guessing he was doing this only in jest, replied seriously to all his remarks and took a dislike to him. Every time I came to Paris from Saint-Germain, I found him more assiduous in his attentions to my mother. He had become the center of her little group of friends, which included Madame de Lameth, Madame de Aiguillon, Madame de la Galissonière, Madame Tallien, and several men. The general's conversation was always worth listening to. He even managed to make the ghost stories he occasionally told interesting by way in which he related them. Indeed, he was so openly admired by the little group that I could not refrain from informing my mother of my fears. She only combated them half-heartedly. I wept as I begged her not to remarry, or at least not to choose a man whose rank would separate her from us. But already the general's will had more weight than mine. I know, however, that my grief caused my mother to hesitate for some time. She did not yield until she saw the general about to leave without her. He had been appointed commander-in-chief of the army in Italy. She loved him and could not bear the thought of giving him up. Finally, she consented to become his wife. It was Madame Campan who broke the news. Our mother, aware of the sorrow it would cause me, did not dare to do so herself. As a matter of fact, I felt very badly about it. Madame Campan attempted to quiet me, pointing out how this marriage would help my brother's career. He looked forward to being a soldier and could not be one under better auspices than those of a general who was also his stepfather. Moreover, the general had not been implicated in the horrors of the revolution. On the contrary, he had suffered by it. His family was an old one, honorably known in Corsica. In every respect, the marriage was suitable. I accepted these arguments. My interest in the success of my brother and the knowledge that my stepfather had no share in the crimes which had led my father to the scaffold caused me to consider the marriage more favorably until the moments of my mother's departure for Italy renewed my grief. My first cousin, Emily de Beauharnais, whom mother had taken care of after my uncle Francois' departure from France, was sent to school with me, and Jerome Bonaparte, the general's young brother, was sent to the same school as Eugène. Having done this, my mother left to rejoin her husband. A short time passed, and the newspapers were filled with accounts of my stepfather's victories. Every day, Madame Campan would try to read me the descriptions of them, but I refused to listen and left the room. Then she would send for me and oblige me to listen. saying as she did so, "Do you realize your mother has chosen an extraordinary man as her husband? What gifts he possesses! How remarkable he is!" "Madame," I replied one day very seriously, "I will give him credit for all his other conquests, but I will never forgive him for having conquered my mother." The expression amused Madame Campan. She repeated it. It spread all over town. The reactionaries living around the Faubourg Saint-Germain became enthusiastic over my attitude, attributing to me political opinions I never dreamed of having. For some time, Madame Campan had been urging me to write to my stepfather. I had always refused. How could I be expected to express sentiments I did not feel? It was out of the question. Yet, on the other hand, I could not dwell on my disappointment that the marriage had taken place. I thought it best not to write at all, but as Madame Campan insisted, I finally yielded. My letter centered around one idea and might be summed up as follows. "I have been told of your marriage with my mother. What surprises me is that you, whom I have so often heard speak badly of women, should have made up your mind to marry one of these creatures." The general's reply was very long and written in an extremely difficult hand, practically indecipherable, unless one were used to it. It was not till years later, during the consulate, that Bourrienne, the first consul's private secretary, revealed to me all the kind phrases it contained. It was about this time that I was confirmed. I took communion with all the fervor of a person whose soul is as ardent as it is innocent. My brother was confirmed the same day. Every Sunday, he spent 2 hours with me in Madame Campan's private apartment. But I did not enjoy this pleasure very long, as General Bonaparte sent for Eugène to go to Italy to act as his aide-de-camp. How cruelly I suffered at being deprived of the companionship of the brother I loved so dearly. The only consolation left me was the affection of my fellow pupils, the tender care of Madame Campan. The latter worried about the intensity of my emotions. She sought to remedy what she called my excessive sensitiveness by developing my mind, by teaching me from the outset to beware of the impulsiveness which later in life might prove prejudicial to me. Fortunately, I took my pleasures as seriously as I did my sorrows. As a rule, I was very lighthearted, even hoydenish. This tendency, to a great extent, remedied my too keen sensibility. I sought always to taste to the full every emotion. Nothing was indifferent to me. Everything affected me profoundly. At vacation time, the mothers came to take away their daughters. I remained behind. Apparently, I had no family of my own. I felt very sorry for myself. This was unjust, for no general, no aide-de-camp arrived in Paris from Italy bearing dispatches or captured flags, who did not also bring me messages and souvenirs from my mother. My stepfather also sent me watches and Venetian chains by his aides-de-camp, Marmont and Lavalette. Everything was done to show me I was not forgotten and that I was not really abandoned. My grandfather was living at Fontainebleau. The Princess de Hohenzollern had left France a short time after the death of her brother, the Prince of Salm. There was no one I could go out with. To be sure, Madame Talleyrand asked me to spend a few days with her, but I invariably declined. I did not feel that her circle formed proper surroundings for me. My close friendship with Madame Campan's nieces helped me to bear the separation from my family, and occasionally I went to Grignon, their father's handsome estate. One day, Madame Campan took us on an outing to visit one of her aunts who lived at Versailles. In the evening, tea was served and other guests came in. Among them was a poet who became much interested in our party and particularly in me. I did not care especially for his attention at the time, but was overcome with surprise and even grief. I remember I cried like a child when the next day I found in the newspaper some verses he had written for me. Madame Campan laughed at the sight of my despair.